Oh, live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on SLAPPs as a lawfare measure against investigations into corruption and dirty money flows. My name is Ben Cowdock. I'm investigations lead at the UK chapter of Transparency International, the global anti-corruption charity. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Justice for Journalists and Foreign Policy Centre for organising this event. I think one of the main things we want to achieve today and the last couple of days is to be able to talk about this issue, which is often hidden from public view a lot more, to really understand each other's perspectives on this and really understand the scale as well, because as we've been hearing a lot of the time, this stuff is hidden behind private and confidential letters. We don't get to talk about this enough, so hopefully we'll get a good chance to talk about that today. As I said, today we'll be discussing how lawfare and SLAPPs are used to stymie investigations into corruption and dirty money flows. Particularly the sort of targeting of journalists, civil society, and whistleblowers who work so hard to uncover these schemes. This is really important because SLAPPs in this area have such a corrosive effect on the global fight against corruption and dirty money, because more often than not, the sources for law enforcement investigations and anti-corruption measures come from journalists and whistleblowers. When they are silenced, that means the information flows that go to law enforcement, that go to the private sector that's supposed to be the first line of defense against money laundering. When they dry up, then we all suffer because these kinds of things happen more and more often. So really glad to be joined today by this excellent panel we've got. Joining me in person is Anneke van Woudenberg from RAID. And on the line, I think we've got Barış Altintas from Turkey, from the Media and Law Studies Association. We should also have Henri Thulliez, who's the director of the African Platform to Protect Whistleblowers. And excitingly, we'll be joined at some point by Tom Burgess, who is currently in a court case related to this kind of work. So hopefully he'll be able to join us later and talk a little bit about that as our sort of roving reporter for the day. So he's with the Financial Times as a reporter, and he's also written a book called The Kleptopia, which I would urge you all to read. So shall we kick off and go first to Henri Thulliez, who can share his perspectives from a sort of more international perspective, looking at these issues.
Hello, good afternoon everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to share my experience here as the director of the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers, which we call PPLAAF. Let me just first explain to you a little bit what our work is and what we've experienced in the past 2 years and the solutions we are trying to find. First of all, the PPLAAF is a French NGO. It's based in Paris. It has offices in Dakar, Senegal, and in South Africa. And basically, we helped whistleblowers whose disclosure have an impact for the general interest of African citizens. And in the past, we've been working a lot in South Africa, but also in the DRC, in Senegal, and many other countries. But today, I just wanted to share our experience when, on a particular case we worked on, which was based in Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. And Anneke, who is sitting on the floor, knows what I'm talking about, and we've shared our experiences on that as well. Basically, what happened is that we were approached by two whistleblowers, two guys who were working in a bank in Kinshasa, and who came to us in France with a lot of sensitive information. They had banking documents showing how an infamous businessman called Dan Gettler was dealing with a bank. Basically, Dan Gettler is famous because he had been sanctioned by the OFAC, because the OFAC saw in him a very strong intermediary between mining multinationals and Joseph Kabila, the former president of the DRC, and the OFAC sanctioned him because they thought that he was helping basically Kabila to get more and more corrupt. And what the bankers were showing us were documents. I mean, it was a strong body of evidence showing that the bank in Kinshasa was probably helping Dan Gettler through a money laundering network to bypass the US sanction. That's what the whistleblowers were telling us. And so we started to investigate the data with Global Witness, the British NGO, but also with journalists from Le Monde, Radio France Internationale, Haaretz in Israel, Bloomberg in the US, etc. We started to investigate the documents and conduct our own investigations. And we came to the conclusion that it was highly likely that such network was existing within the bank, and that Dan Gettler was allegedly using a network to bypass the U.S. sanctions. And we came at the stage where we needed to send rights of replies, questions, notices to the different parties who had been identified in our investigation, and that's where we started to receive some kind of threatening letters from lawyers, including a UK-based law firm, Cowdock, but also from lawyers in Paris, lawyers in Geneva. But we also started to receive threats from people more directly. And basically, some of the lawyers of Dan Gettler and of the bank showed us that they knew exactly who our sources were, and that they were ready to go into a fight with us if we decided to publish. They were basically threatened to file a suit against us in Paris and everywhere they could, but also showing to us that they knew exactly who was behind the leak. Thank God the whistleblowers were safe, because we had relocated them before publication. So we decided to publish in July 2020, but on the eve of the publication, we started to be the target of a smear campaign on Twitter, with thousands and thousands of trolls attacking us with very fancy videos profiling the chairman of PPLAAF as a vampire. We were all working for George Soros, and we were all trying to get the mines back in the DRC, which is obviously what we are doing at PPLAAF, getting mining license back to us. But at the same time, on the eve of the publication, they filed a suit against us in Paris. But we did publish a report, created lots of noises. They did everything they could on Twitter and on other social networks to diminish our findings. And yeah, it was a little bit dirty. But at the same time, they made us a little bit upset. So we decided to investigate more and more the data we had. And so we did a second set of publication in February 2021. Again, when we sent confrontations letters, we received numerous new threats, etc., etc. I'm not going to go back into the details of this. The Haaretz journalist got threatened by Israeli lawyers as well. Some people saying that they will finish his career. The lawyer of PPLAAF, the chairman of PPLAAF, who is also a French lawyer, got blackmailed. Basically, they said that if we're going to move on with the publication, they will publish a recording of him saying things that he shouldn't have said. And then we kind of found this recording on social networks. I mean, it was just, very dirty and very time-consuming for us and very stressful, while at the same time we had to ensure the security of the whistleblowers. And so for the second set of publication, they announced once again that they had filed suits against us. 3 complaints were filed for defamation in France back in October. And more importantly, they said that the whistleblowers had been sentenced to death in Kinshasa in absentia. That we didn't know of. And we started to do our own little research, and we did realize that, yes, indeed, the whistleblowers had been sentenced to death, but that they hadn't been informed of the proceeding. That they never had the opportunity to defend themselves. Basically, some guy went to a judge and get the judge to sign a piece of paper, and this piece of paper is sentencing our whistleblowers to death. And since we published our second set of publication in February, we Global Witness and PPLAAF got also received what we call the summons to appear before a court in Kinshasa, where we were basically facing the same charges, which led to the death penalty for the death sentence for the 2 whistleblowers. So now we've been fighting against this new proceeding in Kinshasa, thanks to a very brave lawyer in Kinshasa who got the Kinshasa court to say that they didn't stand jurisdiction on this particular case. Obviously, the bank who is suing us has made an appeal on this, but we hope we will succeed. And in the meanwhile, we're also trying to get the death sentence voided before the Cour de Cassation, the highest court in Congo, and we hope we'll be able to do that, to get that soon. So just in a nutshell, because it's a lot of information, I realize, well, this case has led to 2 death sentences for 2 very brave whistleblowers. We have been targeted by 4 complaints in Paris, 2 complaints against us in Kinshasa. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, 7, 8, 9. I can't remember. I can't follow up everything. But more importantly, it causes a lot of stress. We had to relocate the whistleblowers a second time, first from DRC to France, and then within Europe to find them a new address because they knew where they were living. We got to lose a lot of money because in France we have some lawyers whom we can pay pro bono, but it's not always the case in Congo, obviously. So it's money that you have to budgetize before going into a case like that. And but the great thing is that we got the support of many NGOs, including RAID here. A lot of we've decided to make very public the fact that we were the subject of SLAPP procedures, because we saw that it was a matter of general interest to know that if you go after these people, you can also get prosecuted. But it's also a way to fight back in Paris what's going on. I mean, here in France, sometimes the judges are more sensitive to a case if it appears on the media and if they see that, like, petition has gathered a lot of signatures from very serious NGOs defending us. But also one thing that we've learned is that we've lost friends. We've lost lawyers, human rights people who were pretending to be human rights lawyers here in France and who have decided to change their jacket to become the lawyers of Dan Gatler and the bank. And that's quite painful to see that some people can be sensitive to the strategy of Dan Gatler, which is basically to get our friends, human rights lawyers, to go after us. But we have decided to counterattack, and I'll end up on this. We have decided to counterattack. We have filed defamation suits against the French lawyer of the bank because he had said things in the Congolese media which was going after us. So now we are prosecuting him here in France, and the 2 whistleblowers are doing it as well. And we have filed a new kind of criminal complaint, which I've tried to translate in English. Basically, in French, it's called entrave à la liberté d'expression, which means hindrance or obstacle to freedom of expression. It's a law that was put in the criminal code a while ago in order to prosecute people who are preventing protests to take place or preventing an artistic activity to take place. And the only times where we have sentences in French case law, basically it's when, for example, you organize an exhibition, which is a little bit radical. Well, the exhibition will be, you won't be able to access the exhibition because you will have a protest of, let's say, Christian extremists or radical extremists preventing the access to the exhibition. Then that means you can prosecute these people because they've been, they've raised an obstacle to access the exhibition. So basically, we are trying to use this law to say that all the letters they send to us, all the attacks we received on this during this May campaign, all the complaints that we were targeted with, all of that characterize an obstacle to our freedom of expression. Yes, we managed to publish the reports. Yes, we managed to protect the whistleblowers, but we had to delay the publication of our report. And all the time we were meant to spend on investigation or protecting the whistleblowers, we actually spent it on fighting back and trying to survive within this very slap timing we had, if I may say. And so basically we're saying that all of that characterizes an obstacle to our freedom of expression, but also to our freedom of association, because the mandate of our association is to protect whistleblowers. So we'll see. An investigative judge has been appointed to work on this issue. We'll see if the judge decides to investigate and whether he or she decides to use that kind of laws to fight against SLAPP procedures. So maybe in a year or in 2 years from now, I'll be able to let you know how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. And hopefully you'll be here next year to hear about how that legal action has gone. Maybe we'll be able to get some similar provisions put into UK law, potentially, as a complement to tackling SLAPP. I should mention, if you have any questions for our panelists, do put them in the chat box if you're watching remotely, or throw up your hand if you're in the audience. I think we'll move now to Anneke, who can share your experience from a more UK-centric point of view.
Great, and thank you everyone, and great to have an opportunity to talk about a case which I'm afraid is again going to take us back to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this wasn't intentional, but what's interesting is you're going to see lots of things come together which again focus us on the City of London and law enforcement. Maybe just a little bit about me. So I'm the Executive Director of RAID, Rights and Accountability and Development. We're a very small group of lawyers and legal experts. We are a corporate watchdog NGO, so we're not journalists, but we do huge amounts of investigations into corporate crime, particularly in Africa, and then stand with local communities and victims to seek justice. That frequently brings us to the UK courts or to other softer law enforcement possibilities to try and get justice for the behavior of multinational companies. And lo and behold, one of the companies that we have come up against more recently is a Kazakh multinational mining company called Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation, ENRC. I will refer to them as that, though today they are called Eurasian Resources Group, ERG. Rebranding is always a wonderful thing, especially when you're faced with corruption investigations. And that indeed is the case for this particular company. Let me tell you about it in a nutshell, just so you have the case background, because what becomes important, I think, for us on SLAPPs here is the extension of this tactic, so frequently used against journalists and other public interest groups, to also be used against law enforcement personnel and against the Serious Fraud Office. And I think that takes us into a slightly different realm, which perhaps we haven't spoken about so much. So much of the reporting that journalists do is to expose corruption. And I guess what we all want, whether we're journalists or civil society groups, is then for law enforcement to take the next step, which is to launch investigations into corruption. And in the case of this Kazakh multinational mining company, that is precisely what happened. So the company is, as I said, Kazakh, used to be based on the UK stock exchange until it went private in 2012, 2013. The company was notorious at the time in the significant press reporting about the way in which it was governed, but in particular what came into focus was the manner in which it acquired mining assets across Africa, and particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This became of serious concern to law enforcement agencies, and in April 2013, an investigation was launched by the Serious Fraud Office, the UK's preeminent overseas anti-corruption body, who launched a full-on investigation into this mining company. What followed was incredibly aggressive legal tactics by the company against a range of actors. And we have now gathered together information indicating they launched at least 18 legal actions in the United States and in the UK against journalists, former contractors, their own lawyers, whistleblowers, and a range of other actors. Sometimes the US actions being used to go on fishing expeditions for information, which could then potentially be used in UK defamation or other UK cases. New numbers have been added to that, not least my fellow panelist, Tom Burgess, who was served with a defamation suit just a few months ago against him, the Financial Times, and HarperCollins, bringing us back to some of the questions about both publishers, which was discussed in the previous panel, and of course against a pretty big name journalistic outfit, the Financial Times. This has gone into a variety of different cases now, and one of them is indeed against the Serious Fraud Office. So a couple of years ago, the company launched a civil suit against the Serious Fraud Office, claiming misfeasance in public office, quite a serious crime, but also leaking to journalists. So it kind of brings us full circle sometimes where slap suits are brought against the journalists who may be writing stories. In this case, the aggressive legal tactics were used against the prosecuting authority, including leaks to journalists. It then took this even a step further, and a case has also been brought against individuals, in this case civil servants, who were prosecutors who worked inside the Serious Fraud Office. So a case against the Serious Fraud Office itself, a law enforcement body, as well as current and former members of staff. You know, we haven't spoken very much about that, but these kind of tactics can also be used against individuals like that who earn not very much money. I mean, a civil servant is not earning a huge salary, who are doing work for the public good in order to ensure that our law enforcement is strong and that corruption investigations, if indeed information is found, can lead to criminal prosecutions. Over the summer, there was a lengthy case here in the UK, which you will have heard probably very little about, a case that was 10 weeks, extremely long, in the UK courts against the Serious Fraud Office and a number of other groups. And during that court process, huge amounts of information came out which showed both the tactics of the company and showed the extent of the alleged corruption. Let me just add, of course, the company denies that any of these illegal activities took place and also denies that it was involved in any corruption. The information wasn't really covered very much by the UK press, in part because the company is notorious for these type of legal actions. The chilling effect silences. We've heard that repeatedly over the past day and a half. But what I would urge you to read is the closing arguments by the Serious Fraud Office in this case, because it shows the extent to which these legal aggressive tactics have drawn out a corruption investigation, have diverted time and attention to a law enforcement operation to fighting these types of tactics. Huge amounts of money, huge amounts of time, and also the chilling effect on law enforcement personnel. And one of the really startling moments in the case was when an individual stood up who and was on the witness stand, who had been the top prosecutor on the case, stood up and said, in open court, "I am intimidated by your client," he says to the barrister who was representing the company. "It has affected my life and it has affected how I do my work." And very clearly setting out the degree of intimidation that he had felt. And so not only does it create a chilling effect for journalists, it creates a significant chilling effect on legitimate law enforcement activities. To date, the company has not been charged, and the investigation continues, soon to be 9 years on a corruption investigation. And I should say that too has had significant impacts on the way any journalists or public interest body or civil society groups like my own organization can report on the behavior of these types of companies. Because until charges are brought, it's much harder to report on it. You're constantly reporting on the same allegations of corruption. And either this company needs to be charged or not, but it leaves the reporting and the ability to discuss it in the public realm increasingly limited, especially when the aggressive tactics are being used. So any journalist wanting to write about this is very likely to get a letter from Carter Ruck, Taylor Wessing, or Schillings, 3 who have been quite active on this particular case. But reading the concluding arguments of the SFO is a worthy read. It's public information, so none of what I'm saying isn't already out there, but it's of course buried in court filings, which people rarely have the time to read. I want to just raise one other point, because my fellow panelists may come on, and it's just worthwhile to know some of the tactics that have also been exposed by this particular company. Exposed again through court records and through information in all of these 18 different legal filings. But it does appear the company has engaged in surveillance, following people around, hacking, threatening types of intimidation, and allegedly and potentially murder of whistleblowers. Again, the company would deny that they're involved in any of these tactics and would deny that they have had any role in illegality. But the extent to which that also impacts those who report on these stories is severe, right? This isn't just legal letters potentially crossing your desk. This is also being followed, going about doing your legitimate reporting work. This is potentially your phones being used or hacked or being used to spy on you. Deeply troubling and concerning, and has a huge impact, and again, on the legitimate work that both journalists and law enforcement do. This case has yet to come to conclusion. We don't have a judgment on the civil case against the Serious Fraud Office yet. The case against the civil servant continues through the UK courts. But I would say the outcome of this case is extremely important for a UK law enforcement and a UK anti-corruption body. If the judge finds in favour of the company, the tactics and the aggressive legal strategy pursued by this company will show the playbook to other companies who may be the focus of an SFO investigation. And so I think it should be one that all of us watch very closely, because so much of the reporting, especially on financial transactions and corruption, tends to attract slap-style tactics. And if that then results in a company being able to potentially avert having to face a full-on criminal charge and the case being heard through the courts, I think that would seriously put the fight against corruption back many, many steps here in the UK. So the impact on law enforcement is really quite extreme. So watch this closely. We would anticipate a judgment in this civil suit either later this year or early next year.
Thank you, Anneke. I think that playbook you mentioned is underpinned by this imbalance of arms that is so profound in this case and others as well. So not only do they have hundreds of millions of pounds at their disposal to fight these cases, whilst our law enforcement have fractions of that for their entire budgets, they're also able to use an array of techniques that journalists, law enforcement wouldn't even dream of being able to use. So I think the crux of what we're talking about today is really redressing that imbalance of arms and bringing a sort of level playing field to this to help tackle slap suits, but also corruption and financial crime.
And maybe if you just allow, I should actually put the figures out there because they're quite stark. So we know from filings by the company that last year alone they spent $86 million on litigation and reputation management. But if you add up the amount they spent from the time they got the SFO's corruption investigation started in 2013, and it is close to $400 million spent on litigation, reputation management. Compare that to the Serious Fraud Office's budget. And they're of course not the only ones facing these types of attacks, but the Serious Fraud Office has a budget, if I'm not mistaken, of about £60 million a year. I mean, even when it's government, it's David and Goliath. And the war chest being used by companies pursuing some of these tactics, it's immense.
Yeah. And the Serious Fraud Office still have to apply for blockbuster funding from government. So they have to sort of put the case forward, and that's sort of backed up by success as well. So they need to be successful to sort of secure their future budget, essentially.
Yeah.
So this is a really important case, sort of the UK's future, I think. Yeah. Okay, so I've got word now that Tom is on the line. So he was due to be next to speak. So can we pass over to Tom now? Maybe. Yep. There he is. Hi, Tom, can you hear us? Okay, maybe let's leave that for a while. So could we pass now to Barış, who could talk to us about the experience of journalists in Turkey, which is obviously the situation deteriorated over the last few years.
Indeed.
Thanks, Barış.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thanks to the both of the speakers. That was very interesting. So my name is Barış. I'm a journalist, and I'm also co-director of the Media and Law Studies Association. And our main work is basically giving pro bono legal support to journalists, and we also have extensive trial monitoring. So speaking of slaps in Turkey. In a country, in a system where the judiciary has been weaponized systematically against journalists is a bit different from than speaking about slaps in a more rational law system as in the UK, which is still functioning. But there are a lot of similarities, and in terms of corruption and finance. We can say that there's an increasing trend by companies and corporations to go that way. But I just want to remind that in 2016, there was a coup attempt in Turkey, which was followed by a very harsh crackdown on civil society, journalists. I know none of this is news for you, but I just as a reminder, so about 200 outlets, media outlets, were shut down at the time, which means that a lot of journalists were out of jobs. And prior to that, the government had taken over many of the mainstream media through a mechanism of a government institution for getting back debts of media owners. So what we have is thousands of journalists who are, if they have stayed in the sector, who are freelancers and who don't have any backing of an organization. And starting in 2016 with the state of emergency, journalists, we at some point we had about 200 people, journalists in prison. And these were mostly political cases, and we can still call them slaps, but they would be charges related to propaganda, terror propaganda, or membership of a terrorist organization. Some of them were related to cases where journalists worked previously at a media organization that was affiliated with the group, the Fethullah Gülen group, which is believed to be which Turkey says is behind the coup attempt. Some of them would be the Kurdish journalists who reported on the region, the security forces violations of human rights in that region, which has always been an issue for slaps, even before the coup attempt. But as these terror-related charges and political cases kind of calmed down in 2018 because most of the investigations into the coup attempt had been completed. They finance news and financial news and journalists investigating corruption became kind of came to the spotlight again, first for the government and later for the companies. And in 2018, Turkey had an exchange rate crisis where the dollar rate, kind of very much like the one we're having now these days, the dollar rate went up from 8 to 9 lira against the dollar overnight, maybe in less than 10 hours. And I just want to give an example of a case that started at that time. And I think this was one of the first cases where a journalist was basically persecuted with a slap for a finance report. And it wasn't even a financial report per se. It was the story of a man who killed himself because he wasn't able to afford a new outfit for his son. But this was treated as a finance story. And I talked to this journalist yesterday, so it's been 3 years, but he still remembers that nightmare. So he did the story. He was arrested briefly. He was in detention for about a day. Then they let him go, and there was a trial, and it was dropped. But it was the first of many, which followed. Talking about the exchange rate, the economy, but most of this was still coming from the government side. And again, in 2018, 4 Bloomberg journalists were accused of undermining the performance of the economy, and that trial is still going on. Just commentary on the dollar rate, and starting in late 2018, around that time, the companies and corporations then came into play, seeing that this works because journalists are also writing about us, and again in Turkey. So there are 5 companies that always win, huge mega projects and government tenders. And so and they're also in the top 10 companies of the World Bank's list of companies that make that win the highest amount of tenders in infrastructural projects around the world. So these companies also started, basically suing journalists for their reports that also included corruption in the government. For example, I will give an example of Çiğdem Toker, who was a journalist who was sued by a mining company called Şembay, and after writing about their dubious dealings for 1.5 million lira. And then in this case was dropped. Another one, T3 Foundation, the Turkey Technology Agriculture Foundation, and some of these cases are more recent, started suing these Çiğdem Toker. And in her case, she works at one of the few remaining newspapers that are not, aligned with the government, and that has a good financial backing from its readers, basically. So her reaction is always whenever these cases come up, sharing her own, reports about this company and their links to corruption. So she's, in her case, I can say that I think we can say that this hasn't had a chilling effect, but not every finance journalist is as brave or as lucky as her, because as I said, most finance journalists are either freelancers or are not on permanent contracts with media outlets. Many companies and the government also sued our journalists who worked in international investigations, such as the Paradise Papers, whom in some of which were implicated some Turkish journalists as well. But again, writing about corruption and finance also, given in this oppressive environment, goes hand to hand with security issues. So those also stayed as a major chilling point for chilling effect for journalists. I want to give just one other example. So Sinan Aygül is a journalist based in Bitlis, and he reported on the sexual abuse of a minor by a local person in Bitlis, and he was actually jailed for this report for one night. But still, he was jailed for violating the confidentiality of an ongoing investigation. But now we know the details of this abuse case, and we are 100% certain that if this report hadn't been made, the aggressor in the story wouldn't have been basically persecuted, and they were given 5 years for abusing a minor. So we know that there were attempts to cover this case as well. So it's not finance, but it was a local person whom the prosecutors obviously wanted to protect. And in these cases where we are talking about political accusations against Kurdish journalists, or we're seeing a lot of defamation cases against journalists, against the presidential insult cases. for the past 2 years have basically made up 10% of all the accusations in courtrooms or about public officials. But I think they're not. These political cases are not exactly slowing journalists from criticizing. But in the case of corruption stories, we have definitely seen a slowdown on reporting on the family of our president and the dealings. And there, for example, there was the case of a businessman called Sezgin Baran Korkmaz. And he is now currently, he was indicted in the United States this summer in June on charges of money laundering. However, some revelations that were shared on YouTube by a former mafia boss in Turkey who's now turned a bit anti-corruption, who's out of the country, revealed certain links to the government, and this a number of journalists did report on it, but they were limited, and one of them is located in Germany, and I think some of the writings actually have journalists have verified some of these mafia guys' allegations, and they have checked out. But over the past few months, the number of reporting on this case, which obviously includes, or allegedly at least includes, the highest echelons of the Turkish government, has been very low. And another example is a very recent one. In Istanbul, there was a foundation called TÜGVA, which was founded by there still is this foundation, founded by the son of President Erdogan. And about a month ago, a freelancer got hold of documents showing that basically some of Istanbul's oldest ancient buildings were given basically to this, donated to this foundation at either ridiculous prices or in some cases free of charge. So basically these people, the former municipal administration gave half of the city to these people, and this is a huge case for. Of course, I'm not where many people should be held accountable, and starting from taking these backs to the city. However, there has not been a single case against this TÜGVA foundation. So I'm just giving this as a very recent example. I think it's a huge scandal, and it shows that these we can enumerate these examples, such as the case of Sinan Aygül, which was a child molestation case, but where you can basically go to prison for doing your job. In the case of corruption, again, as the journalist, you can be sued by the government or companies, and sometimes actually have to pay compensation, which is a nightmare for journalists if they don't have an outlet that they work for. But in such a huge scandal of corruption, when all the assets of the city being embezzled by a foundation, there is not a single case filed by prosecution. I can't underline how demotivating this is for journalists. And although yes, our country is going through extreme times, my observation is clear that in the case of corruption by corporations, which are extremely entwined with the government, definitely has slowed down, for one, because of these constant cases by the government or the companies, which they own the judiciary, which it's this all-powerful being, being against a person who is investigating corruption, and secondly, just due to the fact that nothing is coming out of these huge stories that have been verified by a number of journalists that have produced incredible amounts of evidence for prosecutors. And so it is, in addition to these dealing with these SLAPP files, there is the demotivation being caused by these, especially in the case of finance and in corruption stories, that these is not anything and these not going to courts. Of course, our hope and the journalists' hope is that this will change one day, extreme situation. But we can say that in the situation in Turkey, these cases combined with the ineffectiveness against investigating corruption is having an extremely chilling effect on finance and corruption reporting that we don't see in political cases. In political cases, people go to prison, they're still continuing to write, they do, receive threats, and they're, they're more ready to brave the consequences. But in the cases of finance and corruption, which maybe is, takes a more specialized investigative reporting, it is definitely having an extremely worrying and chilling effect.
Thank you. Thank you, Barish. I think it's quite interesting to hear that often in the UK, these cases are brought by companies and individuals against people reporting on them, but you're experiencing an entire state machinery being thrown against people reporting on wrongdoing, which is quite a chilling thought to think about. I think we now have the voice of Tom Burgess on the line. So
hello.
Can we pass over to Tom? Yep. Hi, Tom.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I was meaning to broadcast live like a foreign correspondent from a magnificent stained glass window inside the High Court where I am today. But possibly the avalanche of malware that's being thrown at my phone interfered with that. So you just get my voice, but it's no great. My face is no great loss, and I've managed to hear most of the excellent thoughts expressed so far.
Thanks, Tom. So we can actually see your face, just a still of it. Could you give us a bit of information about the case you've been sitting in on today, and maybe some of the other sort of broad experiences you've had with SLAP over the course of your career?
Sure. Well, yes, it's nice to be able to broadcast live to you about this one. The court's just risen for lunch in this case. I think it's fascinating, the one I'm covering today.
It's leaving us wanting more. Give it a sec. Okay, maybe not. Just a reminder, whilst we wait for Tom to get his voice back, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand.
Can you still hear me?
Oh yeah, we can hear you again now.
I do apologise.
You said how exciting and interesting it was, and then you cut out, so we didn't hear what the case was or why it's interesting.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating because it's a unique, or at least rare, case of a politician being targeted with what certainly her supporters would consider to be a slap. Just to give you the tale in brief, Charlotte Leslie is a former Conservative Member of Parliament in the UK, who now runs a body that takes Conservative politicians to the Middle East to try to, I guess, build understanding and build relationships between the ruling party here and the rulers of the Middle East states. And she encountered about 18 months ago a man called Mohammed Amersi, who is a Kenyan-born British citizen who's made an awful lot of money in Russia, and who now wants himself to be the main guy in the relationships between Conservatives and Middle East rulers. And what Charlotte Leslie did was that she did a bit of Googling and pulled together a memo on Mohammed Amersi's background. She managed to pick up from open sources some of the basic details about how he'd made an awful lot of money in Vladimir Putin's Russia and in other highly corrupt states in the former Soviet Union. And this memo was circulated among people in the Conservative Party and reached Amersi himself, at which point he commenced legal proceedings against Charlotte Leslie, which are going on today. So he's brought them in the form of a data protection claim, saying that she's essentially mishandling his personal data, and this is with a view to a threatened libel case, which would add to the very long list of expensive libel cases brought by expensive lawyers in the building outside which I'm now standing. And I think part of what's intriguing about this case and slightly differentiates it from the usual attacks on journalists is that this is certainly in Charlotte Leslie's position just someone in good faith trying to make some basic inquiries about someone who is seeking a politically influential position but has none of the defences available to journalists. Now, a Mercy would say that this is a sort of scurrilous attack on his reputation. He told me when I interviewed him in July that he'd already spent £300,000, a total which will by now be much, much higher, and will go higher still, on his lawyers, mainly Carter Ruck, who are specialists in this field, pursuing these legal claims against Leslie. And it is a pretty remarkable example, I think, of the way that anyone, journalist, ex-MP, or essentially just bystander in the affairs of the ultra-rich, can face life-changing or life-ruining legal action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at a time when we're wanting more scrutiny of where money is coming from being pumped into our politics, it's quite striking that one person who is asking some questions has been targeted in this way.
It's quite hard to see, exactly, it's quite hard to see how, just to put it from Charlotte Leslie's point of view for a moment, it's quite hard to see how one could go about, let's assume that she's telling the truth and she did all this in good faith, civic minded, public spirited, trying to look into someone who was seeking a very influential position in British democratic politics and seeking to, as she says, buy his way into that position. It's quite hard to see how someone, if it could undertake that sort of good faith exercise, write up a memo of essentially open source material, and just raise questions without falling foul of this kind of legal risk. And you know, we've been talking in this session about the chilling effect. You know, what does this do for even serving politicians as well as active politicians, the people who we elect to hold power to account, to hold the government to account and its donors by extension? What does it do to that absolutely central work of democracy if that's cut off? And I think there's a broader point. I'm not going to talk about the cases against me, but there is a broad point here, which is that just the kind of day-to-day effects that, you know, one hears about anecdotally of people who are subject to this kind of legal attack, journalists and others. Even simple things like the letters tend to arrive on a Friday night. When I was writing Kleptopia, my last book about how dirty money is conquering the world, I received legal correspondence before it was published that was twice the length of the book, and it would typically arrive on a Friday, last thing on a Friday. It might not seem very significant. It's certainly not significant compared to the risks that journalists in Turkey or Congo face to their personal safety. But there's a psychological strategy to this, which is to infuse the weekend with dread, just to remove your chance to rest and recover. You know, journalists, believe it or not, are people too, and are trying to live ordinary family lives. There's also this trend of naming journalists themselves as defendants in lawsuits. It used to be the convention that just publishers would be named, but now there's an attempt to target the individuals. And as Anneke mentioned, there's also this sinister trend of surveillance going hand in hand with aggressive legal strategies against reporters and others. I know that when I met a contact of mine, and I'm not telling you anything that isn't public and isn't in court filings, when I met a contact of mine discreetly in a car park in central London about 18 months ago, we were being watched. That's come clear in court filings. And one of the remarkable things was that the lawyers who revealed this surveillance and used it to make all sorts of I would say groundless allegations, didn't bat an eyelid about the fact that the surveillance had taken place and that a journalist going about his business, meeting a lawyer in private practice, were being watched. And I would suggest that we might actually want to pay some attention to the fact that reporters going around central London are being watched by agents of very powerful people from very corrupt places. When I was a foreign correspondent in Nigeria, I was very accustomed to having Secret Service follow me and knock on my door, and you know, sometimes you'd even have a cup of tea with them. But and I'm not suggesting that there should be one standard for one place and one for another. I am saying, though, that in Nigeria we would call out and criticise this kind of surveillance, and in the UK there seems to be very little discussion of this, very little discussion of slaps as a whole, and it's simply because they are very effective. The chilling effect is real. Reporters across Fleet Street, usually doing a job that 5 people used to do, under assault by lawyers and PRs and their own editors, in an industry that has been slowly dying from the inside ever since the collapse of its business model. They get a letter from Cowdock on a Friday night. 9 times out of 10, I feel there's no statistical basis for that story. I do apologise. An entire school is walking past me. The 9 out of 10 times, that story will be binned or cut back, rewritten, simply because it's such a mismatch. And just my final thought here is, like, the one thing I would say about my case, without commenting on the actual details about the lawsuit that a company controlled by some oligarchs has brought against me, and my book and an article I wrote, is that some of the legal correspondence has gone on the public record because there's been American proceedings, and the American justice system, the transparency of it is much more straightforward, and lots of documents are published online and lots of people can read them, and it works far more effectively than the equivalent in the UK. And as a result, journalists, if they wish to, can read that correspondence and can see what goes into the sausage of making a book and a news story. But obviously, these lawyers work day in, day out, and there will be many, many more cases. Some of the times they won't succeed, and journalists and editors and others will stand up to them, but many, many times they will succeed, and that's no doubt how they earn their astronomical fees. And so the accumulated tonnage of information, very often, no doubt, in the public interest, that is simply being suppressed from the public record, is vast now. I would say it's vast, and it's growing every day. And when you compare that to a lot of the crap that gets passed off as journalism, I think it's very worrying for the sort of the information input to public discourse everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more 10 things we learned from Squid Game rather than 10 things we learned from Pandora Papers, unfortunately. We've got quite a few questions racking up now, so I'm just conscious that we should get to those so people aren't disappointed. So the first one from Melanie Chater from the Reform Initiative of Transparent Economies has an interesting sort of double-ended question here. So she wants to know, what is the earliest slap that we know of, and have slaps been incurred as a result of private email correspondence between members of an NGO, for example, and whistleblowers? So I don't know if anyone on the panel knows of the earliest slap. I certainly wouldn't like to hazard a guess. Anyone got an answer to that? Or anyone in the audience know the earliest slap?
Charlie.
I have no idea, but the person emerging as a great expert is Susan Cottery.
And Susan's there too.
I think we've got some experts about to speak.
Well, I mean, I said yesterday that for as long as people have been able to sue each other in a private capacity, they've been able to, the rich and powerful have abused the process. And we have examples going back throughout the entirety of the 20th century. But I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to go into a long rant about this. But, if you look back centuries past, you can certainly see that slander and defamation laws were abused, but they were abused by the state. And it's only sort of when with the development of civil law that then you have what we refer to as the privatization of censorship, where you have private parties who have been able to sue. And then when you've had the rise of corporate power, you've seen that phenomenon grow as well. So, you've always had that abuse. It's just that the individuals and the organizations who are abusing it have changed. But, and this is the last thing I said yesterday the same thing, but you can see any high-profile scandal of the 20th century and you'll find that same pattern. In fact, there's a piece I wrote for a foreign policy center about exactly that and about the various different scandals that there were.
Thank you.
Can I chip in? Sorry, very
yeah,
briefly
sure.
on that point. Well, just to you may, I'm sure this will have been discussed at the conference, but the magnificent Catherine Belton's case and about her magnificent book Putin's People is a good example of where it appears, at least, that we've got ostensibly private companies which are essentially, in reality, arms of a hostile kleptocracy. I mean, what is Rosneft but an arm of the Putin kleptocracy? And yet, because we have this system where forces from kleptocracies turn up in a rule of law state, the UK, they can fit themselves into roles such as the wronged private company and approach the court as such. I think that's going to be a crucial part of that case. The use of a kind of fig leaf of a private business interest to mask what is actually an attack by a kleptocratic state on an honest and brave reporter.
Yeah, I think that issue of kleptocracies being able to sort of jurisdiction shop around the world and target reporters wherever they see fit or wherever the legal system suits them is definitely on the rise, I think. We've got another question here from Mona Deely, who wants to know if there should be pressure by international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, on companies who have been involved in slap cases against journalists. Oh, what was that? Is that Big Ben?
Sorry, yeah, that's me. Sorry, just couldn't.
No worries, keeping us the breath with the time. So another question from Mona Deely, who wants to know if companies involved in slap suits against journalists should be debarred by international bodies. So maybe Henri Thulliez, do you know, are there any that you've covered that you think should be debarred or consideration should be given to that?
Yes, probably, but it's and I think Anneke can tell you more about that. I think it's very hard to get the World Bank or the IMF to do anything in general when it comes to kleptocracy and corruption. So I don't know why they would do anything about slap suits. I mean, one thing that comes more to my mind is the fact that what I hear from the other panelists, and it's the fact that lawyers can use their prerogative and at the same time, how can I say it in English? But at the same time, damage their own deontology, their own ethics. And I think there is a question here, and I know that Susan had raised that before, is how can we actually go to law bar associations and get people to be more interested about the fact that these lawyers are being just the arm of people who have as many resources as they need to go after journalists and to violate and infringe freedom of expression. And so, yeah, we could go after companies, but if we could also go after the lawyers in a way or another, that would be interesting. And I think that there are discussions that are ongoing about the possibility to, file suits against the people who are conducting slap procedures, which, could lead to much more important financial sanctions than just a little penalty or just having to pay the adversary legal fees. And yeah, that things we should think about. I mean, right now in France, there is a new law which is being adopted for the protection of whistleblowers. And it's quite interesting because all the protections that the law gives to whistleblowers is automatically given to organizations who help whistleblowers. So, and that includes immunity from jurisdictions. So basically tomorrow, we, as an organization who is helping whistleblowers, we shouldn't be prosecuted for being an accomplice of an illegal act of a whistleblower, if you see what I mean. So this could pave the way to new avenues to get more immunity for journalists who are working for the general interest, whistleblowers and NGOs, but also a better way to counterattack those who go after us. Sorry, It's far from what your question on IMF and World Bank. But,
No. taken us on a journey there, and I think I wanted to ask Anneke about broader measures we can take against companies that use slaps and potentially against lawyers that perpetrate those slaps as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this whole question of enablers is so important. And it's, we're beginning to talk about that more and more, but the enablers are law firms, they're reputation management, public relations firms, and frequently in some of the work I do, accountants as well, which is perhaps a bit less on the slaps front, but certainly on issues to do with human rights violations. And I would put the legal profession pretty firmly in the dock here, because I think there is a real need for further pressure on law firms who engage in this, who help to skirt the boundaries of the law, violate the spirit of the law. So I think enablers is something that we need to do a lot more focus on, and that we need to start to expose the work that some of these enablers do to really crack down on freedom of expression, the effects of what is happening as they're cracking down on the fight against corruption. On the question of the IMF and the World Bank, I mean, it's very interesting. In one of these cases, we in fact documented that the financial investment arm of the IMF, the International Finance Corporation, had been a victim of corruption by some of these very same actors. And in fact, something they'd invested in had been stolen away from them, and they had been a victim of corruption by some of the same actors we've been talking about today. What was so interesting is they skulked away. Rather than standing up and saying, we're part of this fight against corruption, we stand up against this, we're going to try and get the money back through the court process, they really just withdrew from the playing field. And I do think there's a real role for all of us to play to say to big international institutions like that, stand up when you are the victims of corruption, and don't just say we stand against corruption, but actually take action when needed. And similarly with investors, because I think particularly where companies are concerned and where they may be engaged in these aggressive legal tactics and slap-style suits, we need to be urging anyone investing in them to take action to say, hold on, this is not beneficial for society. This is not beneficial for open democracies. And actually, we're not going to invest in you when you shut down freedom of expression and when you shut down legitimate journalism. And I think there's increasing pressure on investors in particular related to environmental harm and human rights violations. And I think there may be a need for us to extend it to this very issue of freedom of expression and effective and much needed journalism. And
I think when we're talking about turning the tables on these companies and the enablers, obviously in the UK, the SRA is going to have to play a big role there. And it's quite interesting that until a couple of years ago, or maybe 1 year ago now, the legal threshold for the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal, which is how law firms are sort of brought to justice, if you like, in the UK, was the criminal standard. So the SRA were having to prove cases to the criminal standard to be able to take any action against them. But that's now been reduced to the civil standard. So there could be potentially scope for more action against law firms here in the UK who have fallen short of the standards we'd hoped they'd be achieving. Got a question from the floor over there.
Yes, hello. Martin Bright from Index on Censorship. I just wanted to sound a note of caution in the sense that we need to be careful not to be doing some of these people's, the enablers, PR job for them. I have to say that if I were a spy from one of these companies in this conference, we've been a pretty good advert for their effectiveness. So, of course, I think, we need to develop strategies in order to take on some of these companies, which I'm not going to name. In some cases, it may be possible to embarrass some of them. Mr. Contraire, for instance, can be embarrassed because they like to be seen as the good guys. A lot of these guys like to be seen as the effective guys, let's say. So are there, it follows on in a sense from your previous comment, are there some effective ways that we can fight back which don't simply do the PR job for them?
Yeah, I think that question of effectiveness is often sort of levelled against the SRA in terms of getting any sort of improvement in behaviour amongst the legal sector. I don't know if there's something around sort of cultural change within the legal sector as well to make this kind of behaviour unacceptable. So asking where the money is coming from, and those firms, even if they are the effective ones, being outed as those ones that are willing to do anything for anyone, that might end up being their undoing. If we look in the sort of PR world, Bell Pottinger's undoing was the work it did in South Africa. So it could potentially be one of these days that one of these law firms goes a bridge too far, represents someone that is beyond the pale, and that could be their undoing. So I think the onus is on all of us to sort of keep the scrutiny on them, and keep an eye on who their clients are, and keep publicising that as much as possible.
If I can just add to that, I mean, the other pressure point here is the lawyers who work for them. And this has had a degree of success in the United States, in particular younger lawyers coming in and joining these law firms. And I don't know if you followed this, but in the US there's been at some of the major universities where these law firms recruit and take huge intake, right, into their lower ranks on campuses, and especially in those recruitment rounds. Students have been standing up and saying, we don't want to work for you if you represent big oil or fossil fuel companies. And that's not the kind of law firm I want to go and work for. And I think part of what we can do, especially in connection to slaps and these very aggressive legal tactics, is to start especially educating students and others who go into these law firms, because the change that can happen from within is huge. As we've seen with Google, as we've seen with some of the other big tech companies, it's the staff that also help to make a contribution. The only way we can do that is to keep talking about slaps. It needs to be made, I think, more public, more prominent. And I would also say one of the things that, oddly enough, I find encouraging about the case Tom Burgess is now covering is this is, the Tory party against itself. And actually, if we do want legal change, we're going to need this government to step forward to bring some legal change. And that means showing that this tactic is not just used against journalists, who they don't much like. It's also being used against law enforcement. It's being used against some of their own activists. And maybe that will help to galvanize them a bit more to really stand up.
Yeah. I think just to sort of close this off now, I've got just a few minutes left. Just wanted to ask Barish, obviously you're in a very different context to us in the UK. If you could change one thing or bring about one vital piece of change, what would you do to make the system better for journalists in Turkey?
Well, in the case of Turkey, of course, going back to a parliamentary system, and then, but of course, before regime change or whatever, I think I'm just going to repeat, but I think talking about SLAPS, international with international NGOs and other international organizations is extremely important. Also, I'm, about World Bank and similar financial institutions, I'm very, cynical, unfortunately, and I don't want to, sound, depressing, but in these governments like Turkey also use financial mechanisms such as the, financing of terrorism laws also against journalists and funding. And most of the times these actually, when, things like that go and, are enacted in countries like Turkey, Russia, whatnot, these unfortunately are again, maybe not ignored, but neglected by international financial institutions. So I also can't see, in the case of investors, right, we thought, but for example, in the case of Turkey, the most corrupt 5 companies which work with the government are also extremely active abroad in countries like Russia, Poland, or construction where we can't, really that are not, that are actually home to a lot of slap cases themselves. So yes, talking about them, and secondly, without infringing on the guarantee of judges, maybe also hold more panels or discussions with judges and who are part of the judiciary, and also keep this on their agenda when they're reviewing a petition or an indictment. Maybe keep this in mind that they could also be. Of course, obviously it's up to them to push ahead with the case, but just maybe create awareness, because lawyers, yes, but also judges and prosecutors are also part of the judiciary, and maybe just having it in the back of their mind that this this particular plaintiff could be trying to silence a journalist.
Thanks.
Barry, could I possibly chip in with a slightly more direct strategy that is being talked about?
Yeah, go ahead.
For a moment.
We've got 1 minute left.
Well, it goes very quickly. It goes to Martin Bright's point as well about us maybe advertising these guys too highly. It's certainly true that a lot of them threatening letters from Shillings, Carter-Ruck, and the rest of them are just essentially mindless bullying designed to intimidate people into silence. And it's also true that again and again when these cases reach court, large parts of them unravel because they're not based on sound legal strategies or sound readings of the law. They are simply there to intimidate. And one of the strategies that is doing the rounds among some lawyers who are horrified by where this part of their profession is going is to do with costs. Ultimately, it's all about costs. It's about imposing enormous costs on those who try to expose this wrongdoing. Right? That's the purpose of a slap, surely. And therefore, the question, the strategy that these horrified lawyers are talking about is whether there could be an argument that in a case that is found to be a slap or some other similar definition, the costs would fall on the law firm that had brought it. And I think very quickly you would see a change in their approach.
Yeah, turning the tables once again. So I think that just about wraps us up for the time being. I can hear stomachs rumbling in the audience here. So I just wanted to thank our panel members for being excellent, and thank you for being such an engaged audience as well. It's nice to be able to see questions whizzing up on my phone every 5 seconds. That's brilliant. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.